This presentation was given at a policy forum titled Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth, co-hosted by GREO, Gambling Research Exchange Ontario, and the Ontario Centre of Excellence for Child and Youth Mental Health. Tara Elton-Marshall presents A State of Evidence, Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling. Dr. Tara Elton-Marshall is an independent scientist with the Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at CAMH, an assistant professor in the Clinical Public Health Division at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Western University. Dr. Elton-Marshall evaluates addiction and substance use-related policies and programs with the goal of providing the evidence needed to strengthen future policy and programming and thus reduce addiction and substance use problems. Her research conducted in 7 countries to date has provided the evidence base for restricting tobacco packaging and product design characteristics that increase misperceptions of reduced harm. She has examined factors associated with problem gambling among adolescents in 3 provinces, and she is the co-principal investigator of a study evaluating the impact of the legalization of online gambling in Ontario. This video has been narrated from a script developed from Dr. Tara Elton-Marshall's presentation at the GREO Policy Forum on Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth on June 22, 2017. To begin, I first want to acknowledge that I have a team of great staff that have helped me with this work. And to provide an overview of how we will go over the state of evidence today, we'll first look at a brief review of adolescent gambling, and as part of that, we'll see some research based on a study our team conducted to provide a sense of how adolescents are gambling and how that might differ compared to, say, adults. Then we'll talk about the changing gambling landscape. Never before in history has gambling changed so dramatically as it is right now, which really highlights the importance of being able to continue to collect important information to understand the impact of that changing gambling landscape. Then we'll talk about the potential for online gambling, specifically with the legalization of online gambling in Ontario, how that could possibly impact adolescent problem gambling. And again, I'll bring in some new data that we have based on a study that we ran in Ontario. Next, I'll go over other risk factors for problem gambling, just briefly describing what factors, in addition to cannabis use, might be related. And we'll go over problem behavior theory and how it all works together and helps us to understand comorbidities. Then we'll go into the state of evidence, what we know in terms of cross-sectional research, which is important, but also what we know in terms of longitudinal research, and what we don't know. Cross-sectional research is important, but is not necessarily as strong as longitudinal research in some ways because it doesn't allow us to look at data over time. Finally, we'll go over more of the research looking at how cannabis use can actually impact gambling behavior. So not just whether or not these two ideas are correlated, but whether or not cannabis use can have an impact in the moment of gambling. To finish, I'll give a summary and discuss the implications of our findings. There's a bit of a myth in the general population that we may not need to worry about adolescent gambling, but the reality is that adolescent gambling is something that we should be worried about. Adolescent problem gambling rates actually exceed those of adults, and the highest prevalence rate tends to occur among young adults, so those who are in the key transition stage of 18 to 25. This is problematic because you have people that are leaving home and experiencing a lot of changes in their lives all at once, in terms of social support networks, in terms of deciding who they are, exploring identity, experimenting with substances, and also with gambling. So this is really a critical age, and there isn't a lot known about this age. We also know that adolescents do experience harmful consequences from their gambling, so we have to consider the very significant impacts that gambling can have on someone's life. There can be consequences in the social domain, economic consequences, personal consequences, mental health issues, physical health issues, issues with family, and even legal problems. And we also know that adolescent problem gamblers are more likely to have higher rates of suicide ideation and suicide attempts. How are adolescents in Ontario gambling? Based on our research, we found that the most popular forms of gambling tend to be the more unregulated forms, which is not surprising because it's more difficult for adolescents to access regulated forms. They can't go to a casino very easily, but they can bet on a dare or challenge with their friends. That is the most common form of gambling for this group. We can see the middle bar here showing 22% of adolescents had participated in a dare or challenge, and this is in the last 3 months alone. To the left of the screen, we have the activities that are unregulated. And what was really interesting is the bar showing 9.7% of adolescents in Ontario are betting. The question here was related to betting for money or something of value on arcade or video games. There has been a lot of talk about the merging of gambling with video gaming, and this is something we really need to keep an eye on and explore further. Games of skill were also popular. And then in terms of the more regulated forms, surprisingly, 9.5% of youth in Ontario were gambling online. What is most striking about this is that this is before the legalization of online gambling came in. We broke this down and looked at the types of online games that adolescents were playing, and we found the most common were sports pools online. I suspect that this may be things like fantasy football leagues that you bet on with friends that you organized online, but we're not sure, and this is something we really need to get more information about. Lottery tickets and instant win and scratch tickets were also very common, and that's not surprising, as we've seen that in the literature over the years. For example, it's common for parents to buy lottery tickets for their children. Now, the landscape of gambling is changing. Many people are surprised or unaware that online gambling in Ontario was ever not legal. Even that now that it's technically legalized, it's still illegal to use certain websites, such as PokerStars, for example. One of the issues is that despite that, we still see extensive advertising of these gambling sites, and adolescents particularly can be bombarded with this advertising. It's unclear what impacts this brand new landscape is going to have on adolescents. What kind of impact will it have in terms of the normalization of gambling, for example? Because the promotional activities and individuals who promote it make it look really cool. PokerStars, for example, who are very good at this, are very strategic about their advertising, which seems to particularly target youth. Here's an example with Kevin Hart, who is arguably one of the most popular Hollywood actors for young people right now. He has announced a partnership with PokerStars, and they produced a video to promote it, with him arriving on a helicopter and very much giving a glamorous view of online gambling. And this gets promoted through his social media accounts, which of course have a massive following from youth. So this is a smart way to market to young people. PokerStars has also developed a mobile app which doesn't have many games yet, but will be expanding. So taking gambling and putting it in people's hands so that they can literally gamble anywhere. What impact is that going to have? Additionally, many of the things that make online gambling really appealing could be things that we might want to be concerned about. Some people have said that they like online gambling because it offers 24-hour convenient access. You can do it from the comfort of your home. It's anonymous. Well, that's potentially problematic for adolescents because they could access it more easily. It offers visually exciting effects and more opportunities to gamble in a shorter period of time, which is also problematic because there are more opportunities to lose your money in a short period of time. In addition, people have said, it's great because you can do it as a family activity. What does that mean in terms of social norms about gambling? It makes it easier to smoke, which is relevant in Ontario as our casinos are smoke-free, which is the case with many other jurisdictions as well. It also makes it easier to use other substances, such as marijuana, and this is another potential issue with the upcoming legalization of marijuana. Individuals will be able to use marijuana, so can get high and then go online and gamble. What impact does that have? There are some people that have become concerned about whether or not people will use marijuana or alcohol and gamble away their life savings. Is this something we should be concerned about? Many of these reasons are a concern for any of us in public health. The other thing to point out in terms of comparing adults and adolescents is that we ran a study which looked at online gambling behavior among adults, and I'm going to compare that to our data among adolescents. However, it's not really a fair comparison because for adults, we asked about whether or not they had gambled online in the last 6 months, whereas for adolescents, we asked if they had gambled online in the last 3 months. So we used a shorter time period, and yet adolescents are way more likely to have responded that they had gambled online. So 9.5% of adolescents versus 4.67% of adults. This is definitely something we need to consider looking forward to the future. Another issue that we noticed is that the profile of people who are gambling online is different than people who are gambling in land-based opportunities, especially with adolescents. Land-based opportunities refer to physical locations such as casinos, EGM venues, racing tracks, etc. In our case, those gambling through land-based opportunities include anyone who gambles exclusively with any land-based gambling opportunities. There are very few people that gamble exclusively online, so the group considered as gambling online includes those who also gamble on land-based opportunities. We examined how online gambling relates to problem gambling for adolescents. This screen shows the problem gambling scores. We can see that 17.4% of online gamblers would score as high problem gambling severity, in contrast to land-based gamblers where 1.2% were in the high gambling severity range. This would tell us there's definitely a strong association between problem gambling and online gambling. Even for the low to moderate problem gambling scores, we see 18.2% of online gamblers compared to only 7.2% of land-based gamblers who fall into these categories. Now, we don't have longitudinal data to be able to know which comes first, but based on other literature, we can suspect that people who are gambling online tend to be the more problematic gamblers, and they're seeking out multiple opportunities to gamble, including online, and this has important implications for treatment. What are some other risk factors for problem gambling in addition to online gambling? We know that males are much more likely to be problem gamblers, and also just to gamble in general compared to females. Problem gamblers are most likely to initiate gambling at an earlier age. So if we're thinking about prevention strategies, we want to prevent people from gambling at early ages. Gambling experiences start with family members at home, which again links back to why we should be concerned about gambling coming into the home, because family can model that behavior for their children. Older siblings especially become influential, and then over time, peer groups become very influential. Parents who gamble, or who have addiction issues and who have engaged in illegal activity, are more likely to have children who become problem gamblers. And that is consistent with problem behavior theory, which I'll explain in a moment. Adolescents who have school-related problems, such as having lower grades, being more likely to have higher truancy rates, more likely to be criminal delinquents, and have conduct disorders, are more likely to be at risk for problem gambling. Also, people who have mental health problems, including depression and anxiety, are more likely to be problem gamblers. Then, of course, we know that there are links between problem gambling and substance use. This is consistent with problem behavior theory. When this theory was originally developed, it suggested that problem behavior encompassed multiple substance use, such as alcohol use, cigarette smoking, cannabis, and other illegal drug use, as well as delinquent behavior that tended to co-occur in the same people. The hypothesis was that there was really a common underlying factor that produced all of this behavior. This research was conducted among multiple different samples, and the findings were consistent, that a common factor does account for all of these correlations among different problem behaviors. When the theory was originally developed, problem gambling was not considered, but with some recent updating, there was empirical support for problem gambling also occurring with this problem behavior syndrome. The people who are engaging in the use of multiple substances are more likely to be problem gamblers, and the same underlying factors influence these multiple problem behaviors. That suggests that we shouldn't be doing programming that is exclusively in one domain, but rather should be doing more that addresses these multiple issues. But what do we know about cannabis use specifically and how it relates to problem gambling? These are a few key cross-sectional studies, and these are not comprehensive lists. Now, cross-sectional research is research that is done at one time point. It does not follow people over time, but rather provides a snapshot about what is happening. And for that reason, it may not be as strong as research which follows individuals over time and establishes what happens to those individuals over time. But nonetheless, it's an important way of monitoring what's happening. A lot of surveillance data is typically repeat cross-sectional, taking different snapshots over time, so that you can follow trends over time and you can look at an overall population prevalence. So cross-sectional research is representative of a population at a certain point in time. In terms of the cross-sectional studies we're looking at, one of the key studies was by Barnes in 2009, who looked at a survey of adolescents and young adults using a nationally representative sample in the United States, which found that heavy gambling and gambling problems were associated with cannabis use. This is important because we need to understand not just whether or not someone uses marijuana once and then becomes a problem gambler, but we need to understand what the issues are in terms of how often it is used and what impact that has. The rate of heavy gambling was 15% among those who did not smoke cannabis and 36% among those who smoked 52 or more days per year, which should be put into context as significantly high usage. A lot of the research has focused on adults. There's been less among adolescents, but there is strong evidence that supports an association between cannabis use and problem gambling among adults. To briefly talk about the research with adults, this study by Barnes in 2015 looked at pathological gambling as the outcome, and what's interesting here is that this is marijuana abuse or dependence in the past year alone. 33% of those who were abusing marijuana had problems with gambling. It was higher than alcohol abuse and dependence and tobacco abuse and dependence. Then they ran a regression model, because one of the issues when we look at the descriptives is that we don't know if the rates are different because we haven't controlled for some kind of factor that could be correlated. so it's important to control for these other covariates. After controlling for things like gender, age, race, ethnicity, they found that any marijuana use in the last year is significantly associated with gambling. So if you had used marijuana at all in the last year, you're much more likely to have gambled in the last year. The authors then also looked at whether or not you were a problem gambler as the outcome, and they used abuse and dependence as the predictor variable. And here they found that people who were considered to have abused or be dependent on marijuana were much more likely to be problem gamblers. And the odds ratio shown here is very high and is actually the strongest association in the model. In terms of cross-sectional research, they've also found that males, younger adults, and people who have lower socioeconomic status, or SES, are at a higher risk of problem gambling and a higher risk of cannabis use. This has really important implications when we think about health equity, because people with lower SES are more likely to engage in both of these problematic behaviors. It suggests that when we're looking at our data, we need to look at these differences, and especially look at differences over time, with implementation of new policies to see if people who have less money and who are lower educated are more impacted, and to make sure that we're addressing programming to those vulnerable populations. Another key cross-sectional study by Engwall looked at undergraduate students at 4 campuses of Connecticut State University in the year 2000. And briefly, these were the findings in terms of the gambling status of the cannabis users from that sample, shown here in percentages. Now that we reviewed the cross-sectional studies, we want to look at some of the longitudinal research. Because right now, we don't know whether people are engaging in cannabis use and then becoming problem gamblers, or if they are problem gamblers who engage in cannabis use. We can have an idea of it, but longitudinal research would provide more clarity. A systematic review came out recently that GREO was involved with, which provided a meta-analysis of any longitudinal studies looking at the factors associated with problem gambling. With a longitudinal design, a study analyzes the same individuals at one time point and follows them to at least one more time point. This allows us to see what happens to those particular individuals. There were only 15 studies with this longitudinal design that have been conducted on this subject, that is, the factors associated with problem gambling, and 23 articles that have been published based on those 15 studies. Further, in relation to specifically cannabis use and problem gambling, there are only 2 studies. Now, based on those 2 studies, Dowling and the other authors of the meta-analysis concluded that cannabis use did predict subsequent problem gambling. But when we examine those 2 articles, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. These are the 2 articles in question, and the authors plotted out their findings in terms of identifying the strength of the correlations between problem gambling and cannabis use. On the right side of the dotted line shows any positive correlation, meaning that if someone uses cannabis, they're more likely to have a gambling problem. And on the left side shows the negative correlations, so meaning you would be less likely to have a gambling problem. These are using the results from both studies, but the Ugel et al. Study separated the results by males and females. In the 2014 study, they did find a positive correlation, so that if you use cannabis, you're more likely to have problems with gambling. In the Ugel study, they also found a positive correlation. The horizontal lines show the point estimates, but there are really wide confidence intervals. That suggests it's not a very strong association, and because of the error, it's less certain. Now I'll give some background about the 2 articles themselves. The first was a study of adolescents in Victoria, Australia, and the authors conducted a sub-analysis of a larger study, which was the International Youth Development Study. This study looked at 14 to 16-year-olds and followed them up when they were 18 to 25. So time 1 was conducted in 2002 or 2004 or 2006. And this is because they had to have varying cohorts. This is often the case when doing this type of research because at the population level, it can be difficult to find people that would meet the criteria for problem gambling, for example. So researchers will combine cohorts to have a larger sample size. In this case, they did have quite a large sample size of over 2,000 people. At time 1, the measure of marijuana use was based on past 30 days. So in the last 30 days, on how many occasions have you smoked marijuana? Then they collapsed that to never used versus current use versus ever used, meaning have used it at least once in the last 30 days. Additionally, the problem gambling measure was not what we would typically find in terms of a validated measure. They only asked, have you ever tried to keep your family or friends from knowing how much you gamble? And has there ever been a time when you thought you had a gambling problem? The second study was also conducted in Australia, with adolescents in Melbourne. It was part of a larger study, the Origin Adolescent Development Study, which studied adolescents and again followed up as they were emerging adults. Time 1 was either 2004-2005 or 2008-2010, and followed up in 2011 and 2012. This had quite a small sample size of 156 people. For this study, cannabis use was again measured using ever, meaning at least once, versus never use. This measure is problematic because if someone tries cannabis once, at a party for example, they get categorized as an ever user. And if they also happen to be a problem gambler, there would be an association there. However, the degree to which cannabis use contributed to that problem gambling behavior would be questionable. The problem gambling measure this study used was very good. In conclusion, there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of longitudinal research. The research so far is limited to Australia. We have no research specific to North America. Additionally, one of the studies had a very small sample size. The measures of cannabis use were based on whether participants had used cannabis at least once in the past 30 days, meaning someone could have used it once in the last 30 days, and that could be expected to predict whether or not they would have a problem gambling 2 years later. So again, there are problems with that measure. Similarly, problem gambling being defined as any problem is not an ideal measure. Finally, the studies examined the outcome of people who were in emerging adult age groups, which is not necessarily providing research on adolescents, so it makes it difficult to use the data to predict. Now, we also want to look at how cannabis use can impact gambling in the moment. The majority of the research has focused mostly on the comorbidity of cannabis use disorders and problem gambling. There is also a lack of research examining the effects of using cannabis on gambling behavior and risk-taking. The studies so far have been quite conflicting on what they show. One study, for example, looked at high-potency cannabis. This is another issue because there's so much variation with cannabis, so it's something that will have to be worked out to manage the potency and dosages and how subtle differences could have an impact on results. This study looked at high-potency cannabis and found that it led to impaired executive function and motor control, but that it didn't impact performance on a gambling task. On the other hand, there has been research that looked at THC and found that it did increase risk-taking in a task with a risky or non-risky payoff, and that would suggest that it could have an impact on gambling behavior. There's also some research that's been more correlational in nature, meaning they look at cannabis users and how they differ from non-users. And they found that cannabis users may process wins and losses differently, which could make them more vulnerable to pathological gambling. However, the majority of the research to date is among adults, and we haven't targeted adolescent cannabis users. This would present some challenges to study experimentally, but correlational research certainly could do more. We know that cannabis can have a different impact on the developing adolescent brain, so it would be very beneficial to better analyze and understand this kind of research among adolescents. There's also some evidence to suggest that adolescent cannabis users may be more sensitive to monetary rewards, but also to losses. So it's an interesting conflict because the key question is, what is the overall impact in terms of their gambling behavior? A large Canadian study published in 2010 also found that people are in fact gambling while they are drunk or high. So we know that it's happening, we just don't know what the impact is, and whether problem gamblers are the ones that are significantly more likely to be drunk or high while they're gambling. We also know that if we're thinking about treatment options for problem gamblers and they're using these other substances, then that could potentially have an impact on whether or not they relapse to problem gambling. Someone may be doing very well at avoiding gambling and treatment may be working, but they may have too much to drink on some occasion and go online and start gambling again. And then they have to start the treatment process all over again. These are things we need to think about. To summarize, there is consistent research demonstrating the association between cannabis use and problem gambling, but there are few longitudinal studies to examine whether cannabis use leads to problem gambling or vice versa, or even how they interplay. And very few studies have looked at the impact of cannabis use while a user is gambling. And that leads to many questions. For example, there are theories and literature showing that individuals who are more experienced cannabis users, who may have a higher tolerance, are not as impacted by its use while driving, for example. What could that mean for gambling and other behaviors? We will also need to understand how these associations evolve over time in response to policy changes, because we have this interesting colliding of policy changes in the fields of gambling and in the field of cannabis use. We're looking at upcoming legalization of cannabis, and we just had legalization of online gambling. And to note, the data we looked at on youth and online gambling was collected before the legalization of online gambling. So we need to know what happens after these policies came in. And an additional effect of the legalization is that there will be more opportunity to conduct the type of research that we're interested in. So we look forward to that. Thank you for watching this presentation, State of Evidence, Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling, presented by Dr. Tara Elton-Marshall, which was part of the GREO Policy Forum on Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth on June 22, 2017.